Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right back to October 1962 to unpack what were absolutely the most dangerous 13 days in human history. We're going to break down the Cuban Missile Crisis day by day, look at the high-stakes political strategy happening on both sides, and check out the stunning, literally overnight militarization of the Florida Keys. So buckle up, because the world quite literally held its breath during this standoff.
Okay, let's dive into this. We are looking at a truly terrifying geographic reality here. Soviet tactical nuclear weapons, specifically these Frog 7 systems, were secretly being placed in Cuba. And remember, Cuba is a mere 90 miles from U.S. soil. From that launch point, these missiles could rapidly reach targets across the eastern United States. It completely, fundamentally altered the entire complexion of the global nuclear rivalry.
So, how do you stop a nuclear war when the countdown has already started? That's the reality the globe was facing. There was this thrilling, incredibly tense ticking clock momentum to the whole crisis. Every single hour mattered, and the room for error? Exactly zero.
Let's anchor ourselves in the timeline of those early days. It all kicks off on October 14th. An American U-2 spy plane takes high-altitude photographs that give conclusive evidence of Soviet missile sites under construction. Boom. 2 days later, October 16th, President Kennedy is briefed and immediately forms a specialized group of advisors, the Executive Committee, or ExComm. After nearly a week of intense, highly secret deliberations, Kennedy makes his move. On October 22nd, he announces a strict naval quarantine around Cuba to stop any more weapons from arriving.
To really grasp this crisis, we have to look at the political strategy on both sides impartially. From the Soviet perspective, Premier Nikita Khrushchev felt totally justified. He wanted to level the nuclear playing field, since the U.S. already had missiles over in Europe and Turkey. Plus, after the failed U.S.-backed Bay of Pigs invasion back in 1961, Khrushchev and Fidel Castro viewed these missiles as a much-needed deterrent against another American attack. Conversely, though, from the U.S. perspective, allowing a hostile superpower to install offensive nuclear weapons right in America's backyard, that was a fundamental, totally unacceptable threat to the homeland that just had to be neutralized.
And inside the White House, the strategic debate was incredibly fierce. You're the Joint Chiefs of Staff pushing hard for a massive series of airstrikes on the missile sites, followed by a full-scale ground invasion of Cuba. But Kennedy, alongside Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, pushed back. Kennedy went with the naval quarantine because it stopped new weapons from arriving without immediately firing the first shot. He was terrified the firing first would trigger mutually assured destruction. And by calling it a quarantine instead of a blockade, which is legally an act of war, he managed to maintain crucial international support. Now, what's really interesting about this piece of intelligence is that it's an actual secret map used by President Kennedy and his staff. It charts out a staggering $1 billion Soviet military buildup across the island. Those red markers show the rapid construction activity. The Soviets were sparing absolutely no expense and wasting no time, trying to get these sites fully operational before the Americans could stop them.
Section 1. Ground Zero. Militarization of the Florida Keys.
As those high-level debates were raging up in Washington, a staggering military buildup was unfolding down south. Starting around October 23rd, the 1st Armored Division deploys 19,000 troops and 2,000 tanks to the region. The U.S. Army literally takes over the historic Casa Marina Hotel in Key West to use as their command headquarters. 4 temporary ground-to-air Hawk missile sites were rapidly erected in the lower Keys, pointed straight at Cuba. And meanwhile, hundreds of Navy and Marine Corps planes were aggressively stationed at the Boca Chica Naval Air Station.
Just think about that for a second. Imagine waking up in a quiet, beautiful tourist town that has transformed literally overnight into a heavily armed nuclear front line. For the local residents of Key West, affectionately known as conks, the fear was so real, so palpable. They watched as barbed wire, machine gun nests, and anti-aircraft missiles popped up right on their public beaches. Suddenly, they were living dead center in the crosshairs of a potential global apocalypse. Let's move back to the timeline and see how this builds. On October 24th, there's a brief moment of hope. Soviet ships bound for Cuba actually stop short of the U.S. naval blockade. But then the tension skyrockets right back up on October 26th when the CIA confirms the presence of those Frog 7 tactical nuclear weapons we talked about. And that brings us to the absolute peak of the crisis on October 27th, a day that would go down in history as Black Saturday.
Section 2. The Brink. Black Saturday.
This is the pivotal moment when the entire world held its breath. On that Saturday, an American U-2 reconnaissance plane, piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson, was shot down over Cuba, leaving behind the tragic wreckage of his aircraft. Now, the order to fire that surface-to-air missile was actually given by a Soviet lieutenant general on the ground, entirely without direct authorization from Moscow. Major Anderson was tragically killed, making him the sole U.S. combat casualty of the whole crisis. The spark that could ignite World War III, it had just been lit.
And this brilliantly illustrates the fear inside the White House at that exact moment. When news of the downed U-2 reached the cabinet room, the palpable fear was absolute. U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara later recalled of that day, "I thought it was the last Saturday I would ever see." I mean, the men in charge of the United States military genuinely believed the end of the world was at hand.
Following the shootdown, military leaders overwhelmingly urged Kennedy to launch immediate retaliatory airstrikes against Cuba's air defenses. It was standard protocol, right? You shoot down our plane, we wipe out your SAM sites. But Kennedy showed immense, historic restraint. He correctly suspected that Khrushchev himself had not authorized the strike. So he bravely resisted the intense pressure from his own generals, deciding to give diplomacy one absolute last chance before resorting to total destruction.
Section 3. The Diplomatic Resolution.
Ultimately, the crisis wasn't solved by bombs, but by a secret political strategy. On October 28th, an intense back-channel deal was struck. The USSR agreed to dismantle and remove all their offensive missiles from Cuba. In exchange, the U.S. publicly pledged never to invade Cuba. But there was a crucial, highly classified second part to the American side of the trade. Kennedy secretly agreed to remove U.S. nuclear missiles from Turkey. This allowed Khrushchev to save face back in Moscow while allowing the U.S. to claim a public victory.
The immediate aftermath was just this massive wave of relief as the Soviet ships turned back. But the long-term legacy of the crisis permanently changed the Cold War. Realizing just how close they came to a total miscalculation, Washington and Moscow installed a direct hotline communication link. It also led to the signing of 2 major nuclear weapons treaties. However, the crisis also convinced the Soviets that they never, ever wanted to be outgunned again, which led to a massive increase in their investment into an arsenal of intercontinental ballistic missiles.
We've seen how the timeline built to an absolute fever pitch, how the shores of Florida became a literal war zone, and how back-channel diplomacy and immense restraint ultimately diffused the bomb. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. Considering the incredibly complex global dynamics we face right now, could today's leaders navigate a 13-day ticking clock with the same steady hand? It's definitely a question worth pondering. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.